Thanks for joining. I know there's lots of competing sessions, so I really appreciate your time. As noted, I'm not a policy person. I'm a policy person. I'm not a technical person. I'm going to take a step back a little bit and start looking at how what we do fits within the global landscape, and what we do and the responsibility we have as standards makers as well. So I'll start by giving a little background on BSI. I don't know how many people know about us. Then I'll talk a little bit about global leadership and what we mean by that. Governance and how we fit into this big governance system. A couple of examples from the work that we've done at BSI. And then maybe dig a little bit on our responsibilities as standards makers and how what we do contributes to the global governance. Hopefully there'll be some time for questions at the end, so do please, let me know if you do have any questions. If you don't know about BSI, we are the UK's national standards body. So each country has a national standards body, and we are the UK's. We're appointed by government. We have an MOU with the UK government, but we are independent. Our role is to work in the national interest. We hold the infrastructure, the national catalogue, and we're responsible for the national catalogue. What that means is the catalogue, the integrity of the catalogue is our responsibility. What we do is stakeholder-led, which are what you bring to the standards making, and it's consensus-driven, which is the hard work that the chairs do to develop consensus. And what we do has that legitimacy and trust that can be used in support of public policy. And I'll go into more detail about what we mean by that. But there is definitely a purpose-driven mentality towards standards and standards development. Why are we doing what we're doing? And what really can we bring to the way that regulators and policymakers develop their activities. So when we talk about global leadership, what do we mean? So there's a huge network of national standards bodies. We are one of around 170. So, we are members of ISO, IEC, CEN, CENELEC. So CEN, CENELEC are the regional standards organizations with Europe. Some of you might be involved in some of the standards development and CEN, CENELEC. Some of you might not be. There is a whole other spectrum of standards that are really there to fit the needs of those stakeholders in different regions. We are also involved in something called the ITU, which is the International Telecoms Union. That is a UN body for standardization, very influential, but is led by governments. So your governments, your lawmakers, will be sitting into those committees and starting to shape the standards that will then be adopted internationally. And there's also ETSI. ETSI is the European Telecom Standards Institute. That's more led by industry. However, there's a strong position for government regulators to help steer the direction of standards making within that SDO. And we are the UK's NSO within ETSI, and the national standards body within ISO, IEC, CEN, CENELEC to represent UK interests within those organizations. I think what I want to draw out with this is 95% of of these standards are international. The value of international standards means that it's cross-border, that everyone knows what they're getting, that these standards align with practices globally and are that global consensus, which enables quite a lot of interoperability and obviously trade. So the pathway to global leadership is really to start by elevating what you're doing into the international standard space. If you have an idea, if you've developed the principles that are very world leading, why not elevate them into the international space? Whoever holds the pen will have the influence to be able to have a global supply chain that follows those standards and is working towards those elements. So the role that we play in global leadership is quite fundamental. In the UK, a lot of the biggest well-known international standards started out as British standards. Even 27001 was originally a British standard that was then elevated into ISO and now is the global norm. So working with counterparts can enable you to create a standard that has that opportunity to be interoperable, but also bring that consensus early on in what you're doing by creating that it enables that cross-border opportunity, and it enables that interoperability for the supply chains. I think the value of what we're talking about here and that global leadership is starting to sink in. Some countries do it better than us. Some countries are much more equipped with the principles of global leadership. But we're starting to see a lot more of this recognition within UK government policy papers. The understanding that if you have a national technology strategy, you need standards that sit next to it, and you need to push to drive the development of standards through your industries and your practices. So this is just a snapshot of the government papers in the last few years that make clear reference to the role of international standards in enabling interoperability and enhancing technical development. A lot of engagement has gone in to making these government departments aware of the role of standards. But now that they're understanding the influence and the soft power, but also the elevation of technology through standards within these different sectors. And if you haven't had a chance, depending on your sector, do have a look, because the principles that these sort of white papers have in them are basically the foundations of how UK government, in this instance, is starting to invest and elevate its technologies. So global leadership is one element of what we're doing, but I wanted to just focus a little bit on governance, because governance is a big part of what we're trying to do here. And what do I mean by governance? So governance is the system of tech the framework that sits around everything, around the laws of the land, around the principles that we live by. They are the quality infrastructure that's hidden, but is making sure that consumers are safe, businesses are safe, and everything's interoperable. Not all of these and most of these are done by different organizations. So you have the laws that are made by governments, you have the regulation enforced by regulators, you have standards, which is what we bring, but you have accreditation and certification, you have testing, measurement, you have metrology, and also the quality infrastructure on one side. And these all working together creates a good governance system. Individually, they won't be able to really create that safe environment, because the requirements of each sector are different and the knowledge of each sector is different. So how can we create a governance framework that's seamless, that enables us to utilize what we do right there in the middle to create a safe, interoperable space around emerging technology? So the global landscape of technology governance is very topical at the moment. We can see that there is different regulation happening around AI. The EU has the EU AI Act, which is creating the regulation around how they see AI within that region. The US has a different model. The UK has a different model. The Far East has a different model. So the global governance system is now trying to be tested a little bit. What we're talking about in this sector is so international, we need to be cognizant of that, because what we create will need to fit into a very disparate global landscape. International standards when they align, they can be really good tools for policymakers and regulators. When the technology is so fast-paced and global, we're the ones that have that international interoperability, because different countries create different laws based around their own jurisdictions. So we're the ones that create that common language. So we do have an opportunity to really help elevate what we do, but also we have a responsibility to businesses and consumers. So standards in general are very good tools for policymakers and regulators. I mean, at the moment, within product environment, they're very regularly used. There will be regulation that makes clear reference to utilizing standards, whether it's around product safety, climate change, energy, fair markets. There will be reference to standards in government law and regulation. So now going forward, we're going to see a lot more of that happening within this sector. So how can we then be adaptable and help regulators and policymakers utilize what we do so that they understand to come to us and understand that we are actually a mechanism that they can take forward. Just to clarify, I know, some of you may be very clear on this, telling the difference between standards and regulations. So sometimes they get mistaken. People say standards when they mean regulation, and so on and so forth. Just for clarity, regulation is a minimum legal requirement. You have to do it. What we're creating here is voluntary good practice that may be leaned on heavily by legislation, but it is voluntary. Regulation also is written by government, not by multi-stakeholders. So that also gives us a really good advantage, because by having the multi-stakeholder awareness brought to this good practice, we can really help bring the needs of different sectors and industries together. Regulation can be expensive. It can take a while. It can't be changed. It's not dynamic like a standard. Standards are very much on, dynamic documents that adapt to technology. They get withdrawn wherever they're no longer needed, which makes them much more of an agile tool in the emerging tech space. So at the moment, there are lots of different ways that regulators are looking at utilizing standards. I mean, in a self-regulatory environment, the sector might want to decide to develop its own code of practice, and then businesses voluntarily agree to self-regulate. And this is very much a big focus around products. There's earned recognition, which is around basically processes and how you can earn recognition for carrying out good process principles. Your 9001 earned recognition. Your factory is working really well, you will get that earned recognition, and the regulator will recognize you and reduce that regulatory burden. I think what we're talking about primarily, and what we see this sector mostly be focusing on, is co-regulation, where the regulators and the standards work together. So the regulator may set the minimum requirements, the standard then works with the regulation to define how industry can follow principles to help meet those requirements. And the more that we can work closely with regulators, the more our standards will be able to become much more instrumental in how the governance of emerging technology goes forward. In this space, when technology is progressing so quickly, regulators also don't want to create regulation that's toothless, that can't be enforced. Their remit is within the boundaries of a nation, whereas what we're talking about is so international and broad. So they are also interested to try and work with us closely to be able to, if you like, co-regulate and create that sort of symbiotic relationship between the standards and regulation. So I've got a couple of case studies to try and sort of bring this together, because there's quite a lot of technical thinking, but a couple of the case studies who, as I said, not an expert in age assurance, but I was involved in this really, really interesting project, and I'll tell you about the cycle we went through, which was basically the Trade Association, Digital Policy Alliance, understanding the need for have a code of practice for online age verification. They came to us, worked together with BSI, and we created a PAS, which is a fast-track standard, if you like, very much a UK-focused fast-track standard. The industry coming together, going, we need to understand what good practice looks like on online age verification. And we did that together. Really successful document, actually, and it was recognized by government. And at that time, when we did this, 2018, there wasn't really much out there that was following and had those steps together. So we worked really closely with government, and they understood that, in a quite a challenging landscape, we'd kind of cracked a bit of a code there. So we started working collaboratively with DCIT, and we explained to them, your solution needs to be international. It needs to be bigger than just the PAS that was very much focused around a smaller stakeholder group. And they recognized that because they were starting to write their legislation. The online harms bill was starting to be developed in the UK, which looks at how online platforms are regulating, are self-assessing, regulating, but also how they're operating, which is the principle. Are the bad actors being bad because they don't know what good looks like, or are they being bad because they want to be bad? However, we know that most businesses, granted there are always some bad actors, want to do the right thing. In most cases, they don't know what the right thing is. So if you create those principles that here we do create within international standards, you'll see that most businesses will pick those up and start using them. And so the white paper came out, and we started feeding into that with this code. Then we started to get regulators involved. So the UK regulators, ICO and Ofcom, were the ones that then need to create the laws that the paper is based on, the legislation is based on. And that's where it starts becoming like a co-regulatory environment, because they're now exploring what they need to do in order to regulate this industry and where the standards come in. And I'm really delighted, and I know Tony was here a minute ago, and a big shout out to him, because his work is stemmed from a lot of these discussions and identifying the need for age assurance at an international level. And it's a really, really good example of building that momentum with policymakers, with regulators, and with civil society on what good could look like. Another one, and I know that this is probably a little bit away from what we're talking about, is AI, because as I said, everyone's creating the regulation around AI, but how can we, within an environment that's quite crowded, create that voice of what good looks like? And we did that with working with the UK government on informing them about the new 42001, which is an AI management system standard. And it came through the sort of the works just as government was developing its AI strategy. Recognizing a big standard like that within a government strategy really raises the profile. But also what it does is it makes regulators aware that there is already good practice out there. They don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is knowledge, and it's been developed internationally by experts, and they can point to it and they can refer to it. And they did do that within the Regulator's Guide that was recently published for UK regulators on what good practice looks like in AI management. And it's been referenced in tech minister speeches, and it's been recognized as this is an example of how, if you are a business and you want to adopt AI, you don't know much about it, pick up this standard and it will help you go through the process. So just a final few thoughts before I wrap up. I just wanted to talk about, so hopefully with that presentation, I've demonstrated the impact that what we do has within a policy and regulatory environment. So I feel like we have some responsibilities as standards makers as well. I think one of the things I would say is that inclusivity is a big part of what we need to get better at. When government speaks to us, they want to understand who's developed these standards and the people that have influenced the shaping of these standards. Inclusivity is really important because it doesn't, having more than one voice really creates that good practice that's much more universal, much more recognizable, and much more trusted by consumer groups. One of the things we've done at BSI is we've created the Consumer and Public Interest Network, which is a network of trained experts who join standards committees to reflect the needs of consumers. And it helps with things like safety labeling. They're that voice that's a little bit different from the industry voice that's in the room. And they bring that interest. And it really helps to make that standard much, much more inclusive. And we're seeing some really interesting stuff come from what CPIN have been doing. I guess the next thing I would say, a responsibility as standards makers, is supporting the sustainability agenda. I mean, what we're creating is good practice that businesses will be using. So we need to make sure that it's sustainable. An example of what we're trying to do at BSI is we have something called the London Declaration, which is an international effort to try and assess the standards catalogue and how these are, and which ones can be made to become a little bit more supportive of an inclusive net zero transition, whether they think needs to be changed, whether there's anything that needs to be amended, or whether we need to start looking at, bringing in some climate advisors wherever there's necessary requirements. And if you haven't heard of this activity, you will, I'm sure, at some point, because I think the team are starting to work through the national catalogue. I think the next responsibility and another project is future-proofing. How are our stakeholders consuming our standards at the moment? In a lot of cases, people don't need the PDF document anymore. They want to have systems that they can, they can install their standard into an analytical system and let the machine do the work. So we're starting to look at things called smart standards. And these are standards that are machine readable, applicable, and transferable. And it's a joint IEC and ISO activity. Again, it's like looking at how do we start creating what we have into a more adaptable environment so that it's consumed by our stakeholders in a much more productive way. And finally, raising awareness. So I think we're a very knowledgeable audience about the value of standards. We need to probably reach out to more organisations who don't know who we are. And SMEs are a big part of that. There could be what we have in our catalogue, these ISO standards, these international standards, could be really beneficial to them. So how can we engage them a bit more and make sure that they understand that this is distilled knowledge that they can pick up? So we're working with the Federation of Small Businesses in the UK to help demystify what standards are to small businesses so that they can start benefiting from what we're creating. And with that, I will stop for questions. Thanks very much. Anyone have any questions? Oh, I talked at you for a very long time.
Anyone got any questions?
Oh, it seems stunned silence.
I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, please.
So you kind of took us through the story of on the identity side and on age assurance as to where from PAS 1296 through to international standards. How do you see that in the UK looping back into the framework and the alignment of people being certified to DSIT to age assurance, and where do you see the connection being made?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important point. That's why we try and bring in DSIT into every stage. Yeah. I mean, obviously we can't make government do anything different. No one can. We try to. But I think it's informing them that is the role that we play, and making them part of this process so that it's not our tool that you will use. It's all of our tool that we will all use, and fitting that into their framework, into their thinking very early on, so that they don't start going down a track that will cause divergence within the sector. I mean, we see that in so many sectors where there's been divergence, which just creates such a confusion for industry. I think the real truth of it is that we need to catch it really quickly and bring them in. And they speak a different language to us. So at the beginning, they might not understand what we're trying to tell them. So it's understanding their language, being able to understand where they're coming from so that we can help them to understand what we're doing is actually relevant to them.
Brilliant. And so that's age. And then there's lots of other use cases as well. So do you see that there will be standards like the international one that are needed for employment and travel and all of these other use cases?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think we're only at the beginning of this journey in a way, aren't we? And I think what will happen more is there'll be more regulation. And I think without a doubt, I mean, we haven't seen much on online activity and online regulation yet. So that world is going to change now. There will be more regulation because of the nature of, how citizens are interacting with technology now. It's much more in everyone's lives, and governments will be wanting to protect citizens, but also wanting to make sure that, things are done a certain way as they would. So regulation is really going to influence quite a lot of what we do. So yeah, really important that they know who we are so they come and talk to us.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
So we're going